Well, welcome everyone to our December edition of the engineering webinar. We're glad that you folks took some time out to be with us. And I'll put on my Santa Claus hat here just to make it all official. But what we wanted to talk about today, first of all, to welcome you and then to tell you that our program is actually sponsored by the Max Connect group. Max Connect is a full service broadcast engineering service, not only sales, but also service. And their main thing that they push really hard is the Max Connect unit. If you're not familiar with those units, it's an IP audio over IP. I've got too much coffee going here. Audio over IP that uses the dedicated IP circuit, and people are using it for remotes and backup STLs and several other devices like that. So check them out at www.maxconnect.com, and it's MAXXKONNECT, as you see on the screen. Well, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of information going around on the web about ATSC 3, or next gen as we call it. And a lot of the markets around the country have already implemented. We just had one here in Alabama, in Birmingham, just about a week ago. 5 stations joined together and went over to ATSC 3. And we felt like it would be good to, a lot of people are not really familiar with all the details of ATSC 3, what the difference is between 3 and 1, and what features it offers, not only the station, but also the consumer as well. So we got a hold of someone who seems to know quite a bit about ATSC 3, and he's done a number of presentations. Our good friend Skip Pizzi. And Skip, first of all, let me welcome you to the program today. And we look forward to hearing your information and what you're going to be talking about on the program today.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Larry. And hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good deal. Happy to be with you, and just before the holidays here. Wanted to, let's see, am I sharing screen yet? No, I guess do I have to, there we go. Seeing it now?
Got it?
Yeah. All right. Good deal. So we do have, I guess, an hour here to go through some of the things that Larry just mentioned in terms of what is happening with ATSC 3. And then also, in addition to the technology, we have this issue of how do we put it on the air when we don't have new spectrum to put a second channel up, since it is non-backward compatible. So unlike the last time we did this with analog to DTV, or now what we call ATSC 1, we're going to have to do it in a kind of clever way. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end there as well. So let's get started. Bring in my slides to move. There we go. The overview really here is there's a bunch of different things that are different about 3.0 versus 1.0, as Larry said. Obviously, one thing is we're moving from an 8 VSB type modulation to an OFDM style modulation, pretty much like everything else that's digital broadcast or digital transmission today. Cell phones, the other TV systems and DTV systems in the world who used OFDM on their first gen systems, and are now most of them looking at second gen systems with more advanced OFDM systems like ATSC 3. We do have more capability to get more bits through that same channel, 6 megahertz in this country, of course, but the system allows 7 or 8 megahertz as well, so it can be used elsewhere. But in the 6 megahertz, one of the demands on the original design, the requirements, was to get about 30% increase in RF channel capacity, and that's what we got. So today, that gives us an approximately 25 megabits per second starting point, and I'll mention why that is just a starting point in a second, as opposed to the fixed 19 megabits per second, 90.3 that we have with ATSC 1. A lot better error correction, so it's a more robust signal, should get into buildings better, should allow window or even rabbit ear type antennas to be used again. And there's a whole lot of versatility to the system. You can adjust the physical layer, the RF transmission part of it, in many ways to optimize for what you're trying to do and for your particular conditions in terrain and surroundings, buildings, high rise versus low rise, those kinds of things. There's also the ability to not just use the typical time domain multiplexing that we have in current day digital systems, but also a new technique called layer division multiplexing, which is really cool. We'll take a minute to show you how that works. And then there's this idea called the bootstrap that's on the front end of every frame, or it can be, but it needn't be on every frame. But it's a way to basically signal sort of in perpetuity for multiple types of transmission on the same channel. So this is an attempt to, among other things, give you a sort of future-proof the system to allow it to evolve and in a backward compatible way, in the sense that new systems can be added to it, new technologies can be added to it, and older TVs will just be able to see that the parts of the signal that are coming with that new element, they can ignore it because Bootstrap tells them this is a ATSC 3.1, let's say, and you've got a 3.0 receiver, and so they can just ignore the 3.1 stuff. The new receivers, of course, can accept both the 3.0 and the 3.1. The Bootstrap is what tells them that, and that Bootstrap will never change, but the content that it signals might be able to, so we don't hopefully have to go through this non-backward compatible upgrade trip again, for at least for a good while. And then there's other technologies that can be can be optionally added that aren't really being used yet, but can be, that could really help us extend coverage or increase capacity or improve robustness of signal, so those are elements we'll talk a little bit about towards the end as well. So let's see, moving on, the next slide here shows you a little bit about that Bootstrap. Notice the Bootstrap is, if the bandwidth of the channel is on the vertical axis here, this Bootstrap's only 5 megahertz wide, so that it will fit, and it stays that way no matter what the channel bandwidth is, whether it's 6, 7, or 8 megahertz wide. It could even be the channel bandwidth could be 5 megahertz as well if you wanted to in a future system. The current system doesn't allow that, but that would allow the whole system to be integrated better with the 3GPP world, the cellular phone world, where they use 5 megahertz multiples for bandwidth mapping for their channel map. So, this also gives you the ability to acquire the signal quickly with this a very robust low bit rate signal. It also has some wake up bits in it to allow it to work like a NOAA weather radar radio, rather, that would allow it to be woken up if the user wanted it to, for emergency alerts that were targeted to your area, your sub area within a broadcast signal, if appropriate. As I said, it signals what's to follow, of course, and that's its kind of main purpose. So it's a cool technique, and it's specified in one of the many standards in the ATSC 3 standard family, which is called A321. All the ATSC 3 standards that are part of the suite of about 24 or so documents to date start with this A / and then a 3, and then go from there. So the overall overarching standard document that sets the stage for the whole system and tells you how all the other ones plug in is A300. And then you see different numbers following that for the different pieces. So Bootstrap is a really important and different key component. As I said, it really allows a lot of things to be added to the system that makes sense, and were kind of initial requirements of the system when it was initially designed. Now, in terms of that robustness or performance flexibility, as I said, we get about 30% more capacity as right off the bat with ATSC 3. And this chart here shows what might be familiar to you, the Shannon's law curve, which is really the limit of how much data you can pump through a channel of a given bandwidth with a typical noise floor, based on how a robust you want to make the signal. What's the carrier to noise relative to bandwidth? So A53 is the standard number for that was used by ATSC to define the ATSC1 system, the one we're using today. And you can see it's just a dot. It's just a point. At 15 dB carrier to noise, signal noise ratio in the RF domain, you get this capacity, which turns out to be the 19.39 megabits per second. And that's really all you get. You either get that or you don't. If the noise floor is too high, you get nothing. If the noise floor is low enough to permit this reception successfully, you get 19.39 megabits through the channel, and you can use all of them or as many of them as you want. Whereas in ATSC 3 at 15 megabits per second, you get this, what's along this red line here. And so you'd right away get what's the equivalent of about that 25 megabits per second, said in a different way. This vertical axis here shows it in bits per second per hertz. But if you just don't want to talk about a data rate, that's about 25 right in there. But notice you have all these different operating points that are available to you in the different red dots showing here. And what's the legend here tells you that what those different patterns on the dots show is different types of modulation, as opposed to just 8 VSB that you have in ATSC1. You have all kinds of variations of modulation from QPSK all the way up to 4096 QAM, which is pretty extreme. But the point is, what that allows you to do is pack in an awful lot of data. This is upwards of about 50 megabits up here per second, but it takes 30 some dB of carrier to noise to get you there. So that's not real practical for unless you're talking about really zapping the power up, and also only being concerned with reaching very close in receivers, or in a future SFN environment, which we'll talk about, really using a lot of SFN towers, a lot of subsites, lower power, lower tower, to blanket an area with a higher carrier to noise and a higher density of signal to give you this at the receive point, much higher ability to receive the signal with that kind of a signal to noise ratio. And if you did that, you can get that kind of data rate throughput on the channel, same 6 megahertz channel. In Korea, where they've been broadcasting in 3.0 for a number of years longer than we have in this country, they're actually experimenting for data casting right now with that kind of capacity. They're pushing 50 or 60 megabits, and they're throwing everything that the system has in it for experimental purposes. Right now, for practical purposes, we're in this range. I've seen users going up to up the ladder here a little bit. We know of a couple of broadcasters who are doing 30 to 40 megabits per second in areas where the terrain permits it, and they're getting coverage that's pretty much like ATSC1 for the other stations in the market. And we've seen some that are just a little higher, 27 megabits or so, playing around with a little more robustness. I haven't seen anybody go the other way, but that allows you to get really, really good robustness down into, the negative carrier to noise, where it's noise to signal. You're under the noise floor, but you're still able to detect the signal. So you can receive it in the basement with just a little antenna on top of your set, that kind of thing. But of course, there you're only getting maybe 3 megabits of payload through. So overall, you can play with this. The other trick, though, is that you don't have to decide to pick one of these for the entire channel. You can pick one of these for a portion of the signal, and a different one for another portion of the signal through a technique called PLP, the physical layer pipes, that allow you to operate at different operating points simultaneously in the same channel, and you divide up your bandwidth. Just like we do multicasting today. Multicasting, though, with all those channels, they're all operating at the same bit rate, rather not bit rate, same robustness, same operating point, let's say, and that ATSC1 gives you. But in 3.0, you can split it up so that one service is more robust than another, let's say, and another has higher capacity than another, so but lower robustness. So you can do those trade-offs on individual channels, or you can set it up so that your audio goes through at a higher robustness than your video does. So it'd be like the old days with analog, where the audio lasted longer than the video did. Video could go to noise, but the audio would still be nice and clear. Back then, that was because we used FM for audio and AM for video. But in this case, you can just dial it up that way. The way that the physical layer pipe works is graphically kind of like this, where you would have, here's one use case where you have a high robustness, lower bandwidth signal that's HD video and maybe stereo audio going through, and then you have another signal that is like, say it's 4K or just 1080p with HDR, any form of ultra high def with immersive audio, let's say. It takes a higher bandwidth, and you can accommodate that by lowering the robustness on it, the error correction elements, and so that way you could get to, say, mobile or more distant receivers, and they would have the signal, the noise level that would only allow them to get the higher robustness signal, but they get HD and stereo. And the folks with they're closer in or have a nice big roof antenna or something like that, that allows you to get a higher signal to noise, can get the broader bandwidth. And in fact, if you wanted to do the same content in both of those forms, you can send it out by HD. And then one other feature of ATSC3 called SHVC, scalable high efficiency video coding, allows you to just send an enhancement signal with the lower robustness for, say, the big fixed home receiver. And so that helps you not have to send the whole signal twice. You could send it once with a base layer and once with just an enhancement layer. And the enhancement layer is only receivable Doesn't need to be receivable on a handheld or mobile device, obviously. You don't need, you're not using a big screen there, so you wouldn't really benefit that much from the 4K, let's say. But at home you might, and so that's another capability. But you could send completely separate content this way and always adjust your capacity versus robustness ratio individually on each one of these PLPs. So that's a number of cool features there. I mentioned layer division multiplexing. That's a technique that allows you to really sort of use the channel twice in a way. It allows you to put two modulations on the signal at once. And if the carrier to noise is, allows it, let's say your noise level is down here where my cursor is in the receiver, you receive the signal. The first thing you get, of course, is this signal up here, which is about 5 dB above the other signal. The other signal initially looks just like part of the noise floor to the receiver, and they decode this signal. But once they've decoded that signal, the receiver can then toss it back into the receiver out of polarity and cancel it out. And then it sees a nice, relatively clean second signal down here, 5 dB below. And as long as that one is above the real noise floor, you can decode that too. So it allows you to use the channel basically twice in a way, and you can have a more robust signal encoded up here and a less robust but higher capacity underneath. If you, or whatever you want to do, you can modulate those like two different physical air pipes, or you can put multiple PLPs on each one of these layers, in fact, if you want to. And one of these stations that's about to go on in Miami next month is going to be, I think, the first to do this commercially. There's been experiments with it, and they've been playing around with it in Korea for a while, but we'll start seeing it in the US soon. And it does give you a number of capacity advantages, as well as being a really kind of cool, clever technique. And as far as we know, it's all receivers that are out there support this already. It's in the base system. So look for more about LDM soon in terms of actual application. The SFNs that we talked about, single frequency networking, it's a pretty well-known concept where instead of having to do multi-frequency networks like we do today for translators, you could put them all on the same channel. You just have to make sure that they're all synchronized. So you can't do off-the-air reception and retransmission like you can do with translators, but as long as you have a feed to each of those channels, each of those transmitters rather, you can synchronize them in such a way, and this is a core technique of OFDM, that would allow you to have those all be on the same frequency, and the receiver picks up whatever is the strongest signal and ignores the others, as opposed to what you would have in analog or in today's ATSC 1 digital. Those other frequencies, those other transmissions would be like multipath and might make the entire signal unreceivable, even though you had good RF coverage. With SFNs, it actually takes those extra, really, what are like reflections, but they're actually retransmissions. The timing or arrangement of a receiver and OFDM works so that it gets the best signal, and that's the way cell phones work as well. And that's why they use a lot of low tower transmission sites using the same frequency, reusing the same frequencies that way with SFN. So that's a cool technique, but it is a little potentially difficult to do and expensive with going to having to have all those multiple STLs basically. But this would be one way to do it, where you put you still have your high power, high tower in the center of your coverage area. And then you put, and SFN towers out towards the edge, low power, low tower, and then use directional antennas to fire back in towards the center of the market. And that allows you to put the signal level, RF signal level, at a high level, even out on the fringe, so that you get, as opposed to just having less and less signal strength as you move away from the high power, high tower, big stick, you get pretty much consistent high RF levels throughout the market. And this would allow you, because your carrier to noise level goes up, this would not just allow you to have better reception, it would allow you, based on that Shannon's limit curve we showed before, to move up the ladder there and use higher capacity across the 6 megahertz channel everywhere in the market. And or with LDM, do it in a way that at least guaranteed that upper level, upper layer would get pretty far out. And then you might only be able to decode the lower level in closer in. With the SFN towers, you might even be able to get both layers all the way out or close to the service contour. So it's really a pretty cool technology. But as I said, it comes with a cost and complexity. There's ways to mitigate that, though. And one of the things we're talking about today, besides the SFN approach, is to just use these as on-channel repeaters without synchronization. And as long as they have shielding between their receive and retransmit antennas, so that they don't swamp their own receivers, which is something that's been some advances have been made recently in that. It allows you to put them up and have, without synchronization, pretty good coverage. If you have a little terrain shielding, it helps. And we do this today with ATSC 1 in where there's terrain that really shields it, so that there is very few receivers in the area that could get both signals, and you can use an on-channel booster that way. Well, you can do that with 3.0, and you can do it with a little more impunity than you can with 1.0. So some folks are experimenting with doing a so-called pseudo SFN, which is not really a coordinated network, but just like an off-air repeater, but it happens to be an on-channel, like a booster would be today. And you can do it you don't have to worry about so much terrain shielding. It's just a nice way to do gap filling or extension of your RF signal strength. And so we're seeing some experimentation with that as well. So moving away from the pure on channel, rather single high-powered, high-tower stick, and the movement away from translators being on a multi-frequency network. And that's going to really help, I think, in terms of being able to use translators in the future, where we don't always need to have multiple frequencies to do it. You could use the same frequency that your high-power, high-tower transmitter is operating on as translators. And they would really be translators, they'd just be boosters. The FCC is aware of this. They've actually already changed some of their rules to allow this to work pretty well. They're so-called DTS rules, distributed transmission service rules, so that some of the ways that 3.0 can work that 1.0 can't would be allowed. So that's going to be an area of development. It's pretty exciting. Now, moving down or up, depending on how you want to look at it, a layer from the physical layer. And by the way, 3.0 is done in discrete layers like the internet is, which will allow it to evolve with those different layers evolving on their own course and at their own pace and not affecting the others, the way a good digital network system should work, like any digital network does. So the next layer up, what you might call the transport layer, it's actually got a fancier name in the standard. signaling protocols and so forth, but it's all really transport. It's the first and only, so to date, broadcast system that uses IP for its transport system. It uses it in a way that is, well, there's actually two different methods that you can use. One called MMT that came from MPEG, which was sort of an IP evolution of the MPEG-2 transport system that we use today. And MPEG-2 TS is not at all in ATSC3. It's only IP. So either with MMT or with what seems to be more preferred, something called route with dash. And route is a variation of a single-ended IP RF that goes only one way, which of course is what the broadcast signal does. An evolution of a system that was called flute is now called route, route, R-O-U-T-E. It's an acronym, and it's used in some of the cellular systems. And so that's a one-way application for it. And it uses also the dash for its the dynamic allocation of the bit rate. That works both on over the air and online. Another thing we haven't mentioned is the ATSC3 is the first system that allows you to really mix and match between over-the-air signals and online signals. If the receiver is hooked up to both an antenna and the internet, you can send different things on both of those services and have the user be able to get content from both. It doesn't require that you have an internet connection to work. 3.0 is still at its core an over-the-air system, regular one-way broadcast. But if you do have an internet connection, and pretty much all the TVs today have that, whether they're 3.0 or not. So certainly as 3.0 TVs, they're all smart TVs. They're going to also have, which means they're also going to have an internet connection to them. If you actually hook that up, the receiver will know that. And instead of doing what we do today, where when we have a smart TV, we're either watching the RF input or the network input, the IP signal, and we switch between them, or an HDMI input or something from an external box. The ATSC3 receiver allows you to mix those two, and that's a big change. And it allows the user to, and the broadcaster, to send multiple elements so that you can actually personalize the broadcast, which sounds like an oxymoron. Broadcasting should be, one thing, everybody gets the same thing, one to many, right? And that's true for the over-the-air still in 3.0, but because you can also pull in elements from the internet and signal those elements in the broadcast, the over-the-air signal. So you don't have to do any browsing to do this. The TV automatically goes out and finds the additional content if it's available. And then you can decide whether you want that or not. It could give you different languages, different caption streams, more stats to put up on the screen, multiple camera angles, all these things that we've talked about that are sort of advanced television, and make the TV a little bit more like the internet in terms of your ability to personalize the content, and the broadcaster to actually add services that don't necessarily have to fit in the over-the-air signal. So that's a pretty big game changer there as well. And there's a lot of techniques that they use, again, based on existing standards from elsewhere, most of which, or many of which, come from the internet or adaptations of that. And so this is a pretty cool new area. This is the protocol stack, just to give you a sense. And you see the difference between broadcast and broadband, with the applications at the top, where we would actually do the presentation layer. It is done basically in HTML5, so it looks in JavaScript, so it's very much like the internet today. so developers can create content that way, and it's presented that way, and can write interactive elements to it in the very familiar way. And then it goes out via multiple methods on the over the air, either using the route with dash, or using the MMT format. This is a kind of either or here, and you pick one and stick with it. And then whichever one you use as you get down into the physical layer, it's using a UDP IP for over the air, and a common TCP IP for the internet, where you have two directions of communication, so you can kind of go back and get any missed packets, whereas in the, over the air you can't do that. So that's why it's a UDP protocol there. And then you get the ALP, the sort of translation between straight IP and the OFDM transmission, as we were talking about earlier. So see, physical layer, and then transport layer all the way up to here, and then you have the application layer at the top. And then for the internet side, the broadband side, it's very much like a regular internet feed, a streaming internet feed. So that's, with the exception that you have signaling over on this side that would allow you to know where to navigate to over on the internet side of the receiver to get the matching elements if there are enhancements. Or there can be completely separate stream content over here that is just signaled and not at all carried on the broadcast side. And in the Miami case that I mentioned earlier, that's another thing they're actually going to do. There'll be a bunch of stations in their lighthouse there, which we'll talk about a little later. But they're also going to signal other stations that aren't actually over the air on the lighthouse, but are still just staying in ATSC 1.0, but their 3.0 service will only be on the broadband side. So we'll see how that works as well. So a lot of flexibility there. And as we mentioned, one of the main reasons to do this is to really bring television up to parity with the other systems that are out there on the internet and with mobile, and allow it to reach other devices besides dedicated televisions, as we have today. And obviously allows to enable business models that would be able to utilize that, and the interactivity, and the ideas of different revenue models for things like targeting and advertisements, which we kind of all have grown to love and hate. But at least television will at least have that opportunity to use it if they want to, and stay competitive, because a lot of folks feel that television is losing advertising dollars to the internet because of that ability to target. So if that's true, then this would give you the opportunity to compete a little more directly. So now up at the top layer, presentation layer, lots of fun stuff there. Obviously, we can have higher quality video and audio, but also more of it because of the much better codecs, much more efficient codecs. We're moving 2 generations up from what we had in ATSC 1. The industry has moved along in the period of time since 1.0 has been out there. We started with what was the so-called MPEG-2 video signal codec, and the AC3, Dolby AC3 audio coding is in 1.0. And in 3.0, we have what's called HEVC, another MPEG standard, but 2 generations better. So that's 2 doublings of capacity, basically, which means about 4 times the ability to carry video in the same amount of bits. And audio now in ATSC 3 supports 2 different audio systems, non-compatible, so you pick one or the other in a region. And in the US, they're going to be using Dolby AC4, which is, again, 2 generations better than AC3, even though it only goes up by 1 digit, but it's basically quadruples the capacity of audio as well, which of course takes up a lot less bits to begin with. So you can basically think about ATSC3 as giving you about a 5x increase in content capability in payload carriage over ATSC1, because remember we said right off you get 30% more bits through the channel from the physical layer, and then the bits that you're sending can be 4 times more efficient because of the codecs being up to date as opposed to 20 plus years old. And so that more or less combines to ballpark about being able to think about it as 5 times the capacity of the channel. And that's one of the main reasons to do this as well, because you just get the ability to deliver more stuff. And this allows you to have better accessibility or other elements that broadcasters do well in targeting your content. Gives the consumer and the broadcaster lots of choice. Also allows this interactivity, which we don't have today, but that users since 1.0 came along have gotten used to. You know, the internet wasn't around when 1.0 started. And since then, consumer behaviors and expectations have changed a lot because of the web being used to having that all the time for access. So your users are much more expecting the ability to interact with their media more than they did back in the day where we just sit back and watch TV. So this gives broadcasters that ability if you want, and it still allows them to do just plain old sit back TV as well. And then emergency alerting is a big deal that broadcasters are play a very important role in and do really well in, do well at alerting the public, always have. It's part of our DNA. And 3.0 allows that to be improved as well by putting in more content, richer information, not just an alert, but actual data that, escape route maps or other kinds of weather information, and allows it to be targeted more locally, so that it cuts down the whole sort of, oh, another alert I don't need to listen to. So, and you just ignore them, the cry wolf syndrome. And so cutting down on that is actually an important piece of it as well. And this idea of being able to mix over the air and online, over the top kinds of delivery, internet versus broadcast together, not just one or, but mixing them together. That's a really neat kind of integration that we've never had before, that the internet doesn't have either. So this would really be some kind of unique thing that broadcasters have, is the ability to leverage both of those delivery platforms at the same time. Broadcasters today use obviously over-the-air transmission and retransmission, and they use the internet for their websites and so forth, and maybe have some streaming content for their newscasts and the weather and so forth. But they use them separately on separate and typically consumed on separate devices. This puts it all together into one big powerful receiver. And it allows that receiver to even be in different form factors. So you can get both the over-the-air and online free over-the-air content, online delivered with your internet service that you're paying for more or less at a fixed rate typically today. And then you get the broadcasters can use both of those methods to deliver content in a really rich and fascinating way. On the video, obviously we can do 4K today, maybe even 8K later if anybody really needs it. And high dynamic range, really, we're starting to see a lot of content like that. The online services that are also stealing a lot of our eyeballs, Netflix, Amazon Prime, and so on, Hulu, those can all do this today. Not a lot of content out there that takes advantage of it yet, but it's obviously increasing all the time. And so this gives broadcasters, again, a way to stay competitive with that. Wide color, really interesting. With HDR and wide color typically put together, they don't usually mention the wide color, but all the HDR systems have a broader palette of colors than you can do in digital in 1.0 today in DTV. And that really can make the look a lot more impressive, as well as the high dynamic range in terms of bright to dark, in terms of luminance. You also get that expansion in the chrominance as well. And then the spatial increase as up to 4K. Although the sets already do a pretty good job, all the 4K sets that are out there, 4K receivers, do a pretty good job of up converting HD on the spatial resolution side. They can't automatically do the HDR and wide color. You got to transmit that, but the spatial resolution, you can let the set do that pretty well. So what we're seeing is, at least during the transition, a lot of broadcasters thinking about and going to 1080p, which you can't do today. You can only do 720p or 1080i in 1.0, as you probably know. You can do 1080p easily in 3.0 without taking up the extra bandwidth that 4K transmission does, and let the set do the up converting to 2160p, and they do a pretty good job. And so that's a really good compromise solution in the interim while we don't have a lot of bandwidth to do our transition, and then later go to actual 4K over the air. So again, staying competitive with the online services. And then later, maybe even high frame rate, which is great for content with a lot of motion, like sports, which is becoming increasingly an area that over-the-air broadcasters are trying to maintain, because it's a great revenue source for them, and audience, popular audience content. Then this idea of what we might call enhanced or 2K, or 1080p plus HDR would be easy to do, which basically allows you to take true HD, as it's called in consumer sets, or full HD 1080p, which, as I said, we can't do today in 1.0. With HDR and wide color, it looks really good. And then, as we said, you get a lot more capacity on the channel using these new codecs. On the audio side, you can go with immersive audio that gives you actual 3 dimensions. Remember, we started with mono, which defines all the sound comes from a single point. Stereo allowed us to define points along a line across the set, or at either side of the set. Surround that we have today, 5.1, allows you to define a plane at the user's level, usually the viewer's level, but in front, to the sides, back. And then the immersive audio allows you to literally have, for the first time, the ability to put sounds anywhere in the space of the room around the listener, and including from above, which we don't think about it a lot. But when you hear a system playing back with sound coming from above, you realize how much more realistic it sounds, because we're not aware of it so much. But when we're out in nature, or out just about in our normal daily lives, a lot of sound is coming from above, and we don't pay attention much to it. But when you take it away and just put it down to a flat plane, we've gotten used to hearing that, but it doesn't have the realism that the full immersive audio does. So that's a pretty cool technique, and we hope to see it utilized more. Right now, you see it in the movie theaters with Dolby Atmos is an example of an immersive audio system, and you can basically do that with home Atmos based and fed through the AC4 codec that is in ATSC 3. So we have the capability if you have your system set up that way. And it doesn't necessarily mean you need speakers up on the ceiling. There's a lot of systems now that have speakers, that even sound bars, that have upward firing drivers as well as forward firing. And those upward firing ones bounce off the ceiling, because most ceilings are pretty reflective in home environments. And that sound does localize above you. And even though the speaker is down on the floor. So that's a nice arrangement there. So it gives you a lot of different capabilities there, where you can go with a full-blown, home theater kind of approach, where you actually do have speakers in the ceiling, versus something like side speakers with upward firing drivers, or a sound bar, even a single sound bar that simulates over at least a certain area of the listening environment, a fully immersive kind of a sound. And I've seen some of the latest sound bars that listen to them. It's amazing. You don't have to hold yourself into one spot in the middle of the couch either. You can move around and still get a pretty, multiple people can still get a pretty good sense of immersion from just a little sound bar under the set with these newer systems. So you can also add more content with your audio. In addition to just having it being higher quality, you can have different choices for your languages, or do the home and away announcer idea, or the radio announcer with the TV content video, if the broadcaster would allow that. And you can all even have like director commentary, like they started with DVDs years ago, and have, of course, the accessibility edition, with the idea of having the so-called what's now called audio description. It's an audio description of what's going on the screen for the visually impaired. So that's an accessibility feature that we've already got in ATSC 1, but this allows you to do it in multiple languages if you wanted to, and just a whole lot more qualitative and quantitative improvements in both audio and video for ATSC 3. And these features apply to both, whether you use the Dolby system like we do in this country, or the MPEG-H system like they do in Korea. Accessibility, as I mentioned, won't go through it in much detail, but you can have both for visually impaired and orally impaired listeners, viewers. You can have the more of that content, and higher quality and higher quantity of it, as well as things that are for just the rest of us that don't need the extra content for our accessibility, but can benefit from it. A lot of times we'll put on, captions, just not because we can't hear the dialogue, but to help us understand what some things that are going on, as well as this so-called technique called Voice Plus in the commercial consumer world. It allows you to increase the dialogue intelligibility and volume above the background sound if you want it that way, or the opposite, if you'd like to hear more of the crowd and less of the announcers in a sports game, for example. So that's a nice bit of interactive capability, or personalization capability. I mentioned advances in the emergency alerting. Just show you a few examples of some of the things that you could do with that, and put this extra content on here, and then the user can turn it off if they don't want to see it, but it's not necessarily all burned in to the content, and allows you to target certain receivers when there's an emergency that is affecting their area specifically. So a lot of help and things that broadcasters really already are known to be, have a value, can increase their value further, and do it in a way that's localized that internet providers just would, streaming content services certainly never will. And then the interactivity, as I mentioned, is based on regular web content development, and allows you to do a lot of things with the set, and it allows the user to interact if they want to, potentially, with tell me more content, or play along with games, even sports betting potentially. So we'll see where that ends up, but that's a really brand new, very powerful system that the broadcaster will have to get used to, and develop a whole new set of content creation for it, both at the network and at the station level. And however, the good news is we've already got people doing this typically for your online, your website, and it's not very different for them to translate that their abilities into the over-the-air type interactivities now with 3.0. There's also security elements that are added in the 3.0 world that we don't have in the 1.0 world. It will, again, basically, based on a lot of the internet technologies that are out there. And this can have a number of capabilities, allow broadcasters to have different, better, richer relationships with their customers, their audience, and allow them to broadcasters to offer different services to advertisers as well that remain secure, which is certainly important with anything on the that involves the internet. You can see how a broadcaster can in 3.0 have each program that comes along. These columns are different programs on the schedule. In one case, you can have a couple of different closed caption signals and some interactivity, and some of those things can come in the gray boxes here via internet, whereas the other blue boxes are over the air. And then a regular audio video closed caption show, traditional, and then one that puts an app on the internet, and then one that even puts an app over broadcast, but also offers a second audio service and a second video service at the same time, like say a separate camera angle, or some other stats that are an overlay, that come in via the broadband. And this is a true kind of hybrid broadcasting model, where you send certain elements over the air and certain elements online, and the receiver can get them all, assuming you're hooked up to the internet service. And then the user can choose among them whether to take the over-the-air audio or the online audio, or add the second video, or switch to it. And again, the user doesn't know which is coming from where. They just see a menu on the screen, and allows them to pick what elements they want, and can switch during the program dynamically. So that's hybrid broadcasting, as it's called, is really a whole new thing that 3.0 provides, and it's pretty exciting. It has a lot of potential, I think. Now, as we mentioned, the transition, we'll finish up with this, is the real trick here. On top of this new technology translation, we also have to figure out how to get it on the air without new spectrum. And so there is this idea of a lighthouse that you've been seeing, where one station in a market goes to 3.0, and it carries a whole bunch of content from several other stations that are participating. And you could say, basically, because most of the time the TV stations all cover the same market area, that market has gone 3.0. In most cases, they're carrying both the main primary service, which is all the FCC cares about, as well as multicast services, which some broadcasters are care about. And you can put them all on 3.0 because 3.0 channel can carry so much more stuff, 4 or 5 times what a 1.0 signal can. But that 3.0 signal now can, the station that did that conversion, their content can't be seen by the legacy receivers, which is pretty much all receivers right now. It's at the start. So the other stations, the 1.0 stations, have to carry that station's content in 1.0 as kind of a proxy for them. And that's where you run out of capacity. So that's what limits how much you can do. It's easy for the 3.0 to carry multiple 1.0 stations simulcasting in 3.0, but it's harder for the 1.0 stations to carry that station that turned off its 1.0 to go 3.0. But they have to carry it by, at least the main service has to be carried by rule by the FCC. And then by design, the broadcasters would that turn off their 1.0 to go 3.0. If they're doing multicast, they want those out there too. They don't have to have them, but they prefer that. And in most of the, I think all of the cases we've seen so far in these lighthouse markets, the 3.0 services, all of their services, primary and secondary multicast, are being carried somewhere in the market by one of the other 1.0 signals. And for the primary, the FCC says it's got to be 90 to 95% of the same coverage that the 3.0 signal originally had. But the multicast they don't care about on that. But in most cases that's worked out well. And if it doesn't cover the same area, then the broadcaster has to be able to provide a set-top box receiver, so that if a viewer wants it, they have to ask for it, and they only get one per household. But then the broadcaster has to cover the cost of that box. It doesn't have to be free to the user, but it's free or low cost is the way the rules read. So far, that's not been necessary because they just make sure the coverage matches the 95% in these cases. And you can say, okay, great, we've got the market transition. Well, you don't really. You just have the first step towards that. And you really, in some markets, would need to keep going. And ultimately, you want it so that there's only one 1.0 service left, so-called nightlight service. And all the others have converted to 3.0. And then finally, that last one goes down and it flips to 3.0. And everybody goes back to carrying their own content. So that's the thinking. But it's really hard to get because the 1.0 capacity runs out, especially after things like some of the things that happened in the spectrum auction, the incentive auction. A lot of channels are already sharing. So there's no room at all to put anything more in their 1.0 to be able to participate in a lighthouse. So this is kind of a tricky transition. There are some other rules about LPTVs, though, with low power TVs, which aren't so low power if they go 3.0, right? Because they can have a higher robustness now. They don't have to have their 1.0 service carried. So they can go 3.0 and there's no impact on the other 1.0 participants that work with them if the low power TV station is the lighthouse, just during the transition. And then everybody goes back to carrying whatever they want when everybody goes 3.0. But that won't be for a while. FCC will revisit these rules every few years, but it's likely to be 5 to 10 years before we see them say, okay, now you can shut off your 1.0 simulcast. So, but you can do it right away if you're working with an LPTV station. So in the large lighthouses, and it's typically 5, even sometimes 6 stations, there's this bottleneck once you get past the first one. And so there's ways around it. You could have your 1.0 signals go from HD to SD. Nobody really wants to do that. of course, a lot of the multicast channels are already SD, like the old classic TV services and so on, and the PBS multicast. But the other thing you could do is use the codec that's in between MPEG-2 and HEVC. The one that happened one generation along is called MPEG-4 AVC, or H.264, advanced video coding. It's twice as efficient as the ATSC1, half as efficient as ATSC3. And in fact, is pretty much every TV, at least in the last 5 years or so, has it in there. And so it's possible that you could use that. And the FCC is basically looking the other way on this for using it for multicast services. It won't let you use it for your main primary service. You still have to stay with MPEG-2 for that. But for the multicast channels, you could go with MPEG-4 or just drop some of those. And then eventually hope that the rules go away and say you don't have to carry the 1.0 anymore in the market. But there is another way to do it, as opposed to these one big lighthouse, which does allow you to say, boom, market converted, which is kind of spin because you really haven't, but at least you've got all the servers, or not all of them, but a bunch of them, maybe the main networks, all on one 3.0 stick. Another approach is to do it in just pairs of stations. So let's take a look at two stations, for example. Hope you don't mind, we're going over a few minutes here, but these two stations, one of them has an HD primary and a couple SDs. The other one has two HDs. One of its aux services is a second HD channel. Maybe it's carrying two networks in a small market, and then one other SD. Okay, so that's the way it is today. If it wanted to convert, one of them would go to 3.0. So this would be a tiny lighthouse, or what I call a dance partner, where you just do it 2 by 2. And you need to get the whole market, you need a bunch of these to happen, but they can all happen at once or in sequence. And it's a lot better way to go in some respects, because you're already at one station. You're already down to one 1.0 station in every pairing here. So you're ready to, you're at the beginning and the end of the transition process immediately with this, except that you're only doing it for two stations at a time. So the 3.0 station has no trouble carrying its own stuff plus the other station stuff. The trick is, again, how much can you squeeze into the 1.0? So in this case, it's getting, this station is able to get its HD and its the other station's SD over here, as well as it's possible to get the aux1 as well over here. So I don't show it, but it's right now the limit basically is on an ATSC1 service, you can put 3 HDs and 3 SDs with reasonable quality. Now, if all 3 of those HDs were running sports at the same time, might not look so great. But assuming that you can live with a little degradation, or that it's not running high motion content or tough content in any case, you can get 3 HDs and 3 SDs on a 1.0. You can certainly get 2 HDs and 3 or 4 SDs without any trouble, even if they are running some sports. So that's a possibility there. The other case would be that then, of course, this channel, it's even doing that, the 3.0 still has a lot of bandwidth left, and it can play around with it, do other experimental things, get some revenue producing service through data casting, let's say. We haven't really talked about that. That's speculative, but it's possible. You can even do it with 3 stations. So you can have a smaller lighthouse, basically. And this works out well, because then you can spread this station's content around between 2 different stations. And so you're not overloading any one of the 1.0 stations. And you still have some spectrum available for this on the 3.0 station to do other things with during the transition. And then eventually you could move, in that case, to turning the second station and a second station into 3.0 in this three pair, the triple play here. And again, now you're maxing out the capacity on the 1.0 station, but that's where you could put your multicast services in MPEG-4 and squeeze them in a little better and maybe get up to even 4 HDs and 4 or even more SDs on there. I know of at least a few stations already that are doing 3 HDs and 4 or more, up to 7, I know in one case, SDs. Some of the SDs, I mean, again, you can tweak the content. If some of the multicast content isn't that great to begin with, some of these services that are coming from overseas and analog, like ethnic services and so on, they're pretty bad. Look, they don't look that great to begin with. So you can really dial down the bit rate on those and not cause any more degradation than not make it look any worse than it is coming in. So you can optimize for different services on these today's encoders. And even the MPEG-2 ATSC1 encoders have gotten a lot better than they were originally. So you can squeeze a little bit more in than you used to be able to. And then in this case, these other stations still have a lot of spectrum available during the transition for other stuff. And then finally, they go back to, once the transition is over, everybody goes back to, they're carrying their own stuff, but now in 3.0, they're all in 3.0 here. And this is why we're doing this ultimately, because everybody gets more capacity. Everybody gets basically like a whole nother station's worth of capacity by ATSC1 metrics. Even though you're only still gonna have one license, you've got basically 2 stations worth or more of capacity. And as I said, ultimately you could say you get about 5x, but practically speaking, you're at least doubling, if not, because then you can play with robustness and even get more service density into the market and better over-the-air reception, and trade off some of that, as well as potentially use some of that excess capacity for other things like data casting. And if finally, if you have one of these stations is involved is a low power, well, that makes it even easier, because these services can just go away and not have to show up being carried by the stations that remain 1.0. So in that case, looking at the case we had before with the triple play, you don't have to have these services can just get shut off. Probably when the LP station goes 3.0, they could keep them on, but if they're paying for these, like if this is a home shopping or something, a lot of these low power operators are basically just, purely in it as a profit center. And there's no reason, when there's not many viewers with 3.0 sets, to keep carrying this service, because it's not going to be carried in 1.0. That's the whole point. You can make a deal where you did that, or one of these stations could buy the low power station. And this is what's happening in some markets, which is why these low power licenses are going up fast. So because of this capability, this kind of loophole to the transition. But of course, they can carry all the other station stuff easily. The other stations don't have to carry their stuff. So there's no reciprocity to the coverage to the carriage rather, service mapping when you've got an LP as your lighthouse or your dance partner. And meanwhile, the LP can still play around with their other bandwidth and do other stuff and make more revenue that way. And then you could even do with LP, you could do a second stage where one of the other full powers goes 3.0, and the same goes. You don't have to worry about carrying this LP's content. You just have to make sure that the other station that went gets carried by the remaining 1.0 service. So there's a lot of flexibility with when one of your partners is an LP. And then you've got even more, because this station doesn't have to carry the station C's 3.0 because they're carrying it themselves. So it's a very cool way to go if you put one LP into the mix. And then they already have that capability at station C to play around with other things. And then eventually everybody goes to 3.0 and goes back to carrying their own stuff. And the LP is basically given a whole new lease on life. They can do whatever they want now. They don't have to carry anything. Again, if you now own, if that one of these other full powers owns that LP, they can use it that way as a second channel. But basically, this is where you get the true, 500% quote unquote excess capacity. In other words, all new capabilities, whereas you get basically more than double your content on the other stations, as we said. So that's a different way to go than the big 5+ station lighthouses. And what can you do with that excess capacity? All kinds of things here, as we've kind of mentioned going along. This is just a short list of potential additional television, first of all, but also during the transition, of course, you need to share spectrum, but data casting, there's a number of use cases that have come up that could all potentially be subscription services or B2B services where there could really be new revenue streams for broadcasters. So this is all part of that capability, as well as the interactive elements and the hybrid broadcasting elements we talked about before, which are really new extensions to traditional television services. So that's where we'll quit. Sorry to run over a little here. Leave you with a few resources. I'll provide these slides to Larry. You can send them around if you want them. And if there are a couple of quick questions, if you're still on the call here, we can take them now, or I can take them later via email if you'd like.
Skip, there was one question that I had heard off and on, and I know that SMPTE 2110 is not actually part of ATSC 3, but is that something that would be advantageous for stations to switch over to 2110 if they're going ATSC 3?
Sure. 2110 obviously is a production standard, and ATSC is a transmission standard. But as you notice, the transport is IP based, just like 2110 is, right? And so, yeah, there's great synergy for a broadcaster to have a plant, a production facility that's and a switching, mesh control, all that eventually switches to 2110. It's all IP based. The interfaces are a lot easier than to get into the ATSC 3 transmission side of the operation because it's IP all the way through.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yep.
All right, Skip, I sure appreciate the time, and this was a very informative presentation, and I'm sure it's sort of a moving target.
Yeah.
And it's changing every day, and the best thing to do is just keep up with it to see what's going on.
Exactly right. Yeah.
All right.
More and more markets switching over all the time, so we're all going to be affected one way or another by this soon. So yeah,
that's exactly right. Well, thanks again.
Okay.
Real quickly, I want to switch over to John. If you want to say a couple of words about the EAS.
Sure. Yes, definitely. I know a number of you have received emails from both Larry and myself and your other state associations, but Office of Homeland Security and EAS sent out a notification last week that ETRS Form 1, which was required to be filled out during the year 2022, which many of us, including myself, forgot. That has been extended until February the 28th. Now, the first thing we'll tell you is if you hop on board and want to sign up and complete the form, you can't do that. It will not be active until January the 3rd. So the completion period is between January the 3rd and February the 28th. And do not forget, there'll be more notices coming out, but put that on your to-do list right after the first of the year. Larry?
Okay, thanks, John. We want to thank everybody for being with us today. Our next seminar will actually be on January the 17th, and this will actually carry information about EAS. We're going to have representatives from all three manufacturers, from Dasdaq, Sage, and Gorman Redlick will be on with us to talk about the upcoming changes having to do with prioritized cap polling and some upgrades like that. So be sure to join us. Put that on your calendar. It's January 17th at 10 a.m. Central Time, and we'll have those three people on the call with us. So thank everybody for joining us today. I know we went over a little bit, but this was a very most interesting program from Skip, and we want to thank him again for being a part of us. So we'll see you again in January.
Thanks. Happy holidays, everyone.
Yeah,
Take care.
thanks, Skip.
Thank you. Bye-bye.